And with that said, let's get into leading the change in mobile. I would like to introduce Mr. Andy Drake. He is head of online and business development at Holland Partners. And we're going to have a little chat with Neil, and we're going to learn something new, and we're going to hold it against the other people that didn't show up.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks, Jacqueline. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very confident that we won't do the graveyard slot in a graveyard manner. I'm delighted to introduce in about 1 minute and 25 seconds Neil Smith, who's the global MD of CrowdLab, which is a 5 years into your life, a company that's dedicated purely to doing mobile research. And we're not going to talk, be really explicit up front, we're not going to be talking about putting surveys on a phone. This is really about the true benefits of what mobile can do. And I'm aware that it's not only CrowdLab, there's several other companies we've seen already in over the last 24 hours who are looking to are operating in that space. And I do get there's a bit of a groundswell developing. There's been a lot of talk about this area, but I think there is some degree of momentum building. I'm delighted to introduce Neil for two reasons. One is that I'm big on numbers. I've worked in quantitative research for over 25 years. And I think the fastest growing demographic segment of SampleCon 2016 is Brits. I think there's at least 4 of us in the room now. So using maths I think we're at about 2% share. Out on the beer last night, that was probably challenged by a few, I noticed there's quite a few Canadians, so I am subject to being challenged, but it's good that we are growing our segment of the market. That comes at a cost, however. And I have to say sorry up front because I'm English. It's likely over the next 35 minutes and any interactions with Brits and Canadians, you will hear sorry a lot more. I've done it twice already. You will hear a boot, which is still a word that I can't quite fathom. And relevant to the session that Neil's going to kick off in a minute, you will hear us talk about mobile, not mobile. So, sorry. Picking up on listening this morning, I think there were some really interesting elements that do connect the piece to what Neil's going to cover. And it came in probably all of the sessions. First up, I thought Chuck in his great opening keynote talked about thinking like a consumer. I mean, it's blindingly obvious, but I think as an industry, we often largely ignore that principle. So I think Neil will speak directly to the importance of that. Melanie talked about intelligence of the mind and getting that into tech. I think this is definitely not a sales pitch for these guys, but I think is completely central to getting the mobile offer right. Lenny talked about getting value out of participants or ensuring that they derive the value out of stuff and going where the consumers are. I think both those areas are pertinent to what Neil's going to cover. You know, there was towards the end some stuff that was covered by Frank Kelly about make the vehicle interesting. I think that's wholly important to it. And Dave Carruthers' point about the need for emotional connection is I think, spot on. So Neil's got some fab case histories. He wants to talk to you about the reality, and it's here. It's not this mobile's 5 years away. They're already doing it. They've been doing it for 5 years, and I think it's cool and exciting. Neil.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. So Andy stole a lot of my jokes at the beginning, talking about saying sorry for being British, so I'll skip all of that. I really want to talk about mobile and what I think it is and what I think it isn't, because I think that there's a real change in emphasis on the way that we understand mobile that's important. But before I get into that point, I just want us to kind of cast our minds back a little bit to a time before we had to worry about smartphones, before we had to think about what a nuisance they were when we were trying to sort of be in these conferences and what that sort of meant for us. We used to ring people up, and we used to do telephone surveys with people. We used to sort of be chatting to them on the phone. People were at home, you could assume, most of the time. They were comfortable. It was easy for people to engage for a longer period of time. Then, when online research came along, we could make a lot of the same sort of assumptions. We were doing online research. People were probably at home. Maybe they were at the office, but they're at a desk. They were kind of comfortable. We could, allow them to engage, assume they could engage for a longer period of time. And what we did as researchers was we were lazy. We took what we were doing on telephone surveys and we just stuck it online. And I think that we screwed up. I think that that laziness in the way that we approached it meant that we never really thought about what it meant to do research via that channel, what it meant to do online and what that meant for us. And I think we're very much in danger of doing exactly the same thing again with mobile research and just talking about, how do we do online research on a phone? There we are. We've skipped ahead now. So our conversations are about online on a mobile. How do we optimize online for mobile devices? What does mobile mean for the 30-minute survey? How should grids work on mobile? These are the sorts of conversations that we're having at conferences, when I'm listening to webinars. And in fact, I recall listening in to a best practice about mobile webinar, and the question came up, how do we do grids on mobile? And the guy's answer was just make them really, really, really small. It's not an answer, it's not a solution. And what it leads to is some really ugly, shitty surveys. We've got to fight that. And I think that the fundamental issue with it is that our emphasis is in the wrong place, because this is not mobile. This is mobile. Being able to walk around, being able to understand that our participants are not tethered to a computer screen or tethered to a phone at home. And what does that mean for the context in which they're doing research? And, if we've gone from a place where our surveys, we can assume our surveys are being conducted in this pretty little research bubble where we can throw whatever content we want at them, we've moved away from that place. We can't make those assumptions anymore. Now, mobile research means that when they're doing these surveys or they're doing this research, they might be at home, sure, but they might be having on a commute. They might be at work. They might be shopping, actually making a purchase. They might be on holiday, sipping a martini. How many of us, honestly, have ever used our mobiles when we're sat on the toilets? These are the sorts of contexts in which, we need to be considering, and we need to think about what context means for doing research and how we incorporate that into our design. One of the key things is clearly people can't engage for that sort of 30-minute period anymore. So context is king for mobile research. And we can either choose to force people to complete surveys at home. We can say that we understand that you could be doing this all over the place, but to just make our lives easy and be consistent, these sorts of surveys, this sort of research has to be done within this sort of context. I mean, if you think about this, these are the sort of conversations that we were having when we're talking about face-to-face research. Back in the day, if you were doing face-to-face research about brand tracking type study, you had to be very careful that you didn't position your interviewer team underneath a massive billboard advertising the competitor. Context mattered to some extent to face-to-face research, but it matters completely to the research we do on mobile. So we can either straitjacket it, or we can embrace mobility. We can embrace the fact that people can move around, can sort of go through some sort of a journey, set free our participants and let them do whatever they want. And I think when we start to think about how you do research in this mobile way, letting people take part whenever, wherever they are, and ideally however they want, incorporating something that Dave was saying, allowing videos, photos, different media, maybe even allowing the participants to make some sort of choice about how they complete these sorts of tasks. That becomes a very different type of research and really starts to make the most of this channel. So what should mobile research look like? Well, I think that if we're not looking to online research for the cues as to what this sort of channel should look like, a good place actually is to look at the sorts of design guidelines and principles that companies like Apple and Google publish about how people use software on the go. So if you think, use outside of the research context, there's these sorts of touch points. And I've kind of paraphrased them a little bit here, so apologies to the guy from Google Consumer Surveys. But sort of three key principles are, firstly, break it into smaller steps. So instead of thinking about a 30-minute, a 58-minute survey, think about how that same project might be broken up into much, much smaller chunks. Think about, rather than a 30-minute survey, lots and lots of kind of micro interactions with the research project. If we're delivering something which is truly mobile, if we're thinking about the participant rather than using this device, we have to acknowledge that sometimes people are offline. If I'm doing a survey or doing a research project and I want to understand people's interactions with advertising, some of the advertising that they're going to see is while they're on the subway. They've got no chance of a connection, no chance of Wi-Fi or 3G or anything. So the sorts of tools that we're using have to allow for the fact that people should be able to access it offline wherever they are. Only show what I need when I need it. So think about if we're breaking this content up into micro interactions, make sure that those micro interactions have some sort of context setting, that they are right and relevant for the participant at that point in time. Because what you don't want to do is just overwhelm them. You've taken a 30-minute survey, now you've got 300 different micro interactions. Make sure that those are relevant to that particular moment. And why should you bother? What does this mean for us? Well, if participants have access to a research project wherever they are, it opens up new possibilities for us as researchers. If you're doing a project about advertising, participants can be taking photographs of the advertising that they see, rating it kind of wherever they are, and as soon as they see them. So you get closer to that point and how they felt about it when they saw it. They can be in the supermarket. They can be in the shop. So instead of asking them to reflect on what they thought about the decision process 30 days ago, you can ask them, what are you doing right now? Record a video of yourself narrating your sort of decision-making process when you're stood in front of the products that you're making that decision around. And take the example of a commute. We can ask them to check in every step along the way, telling us the highs and lows of their commute. So instead of us thinking about, over the last year, have you ever experienced a problem with the bus network or the rail network? And you're like, yeah, probably, it's rubbish, but I couldn't tell you what it was. Being able to have access to it when they're doing it, actually on the commute itself, telling you about those sort of moments as they actually happen completely changes the sort of research you're doing. Similarly, we all move in a very different way. And I desperately want to have a picture of a DeLorean here or like a police box or something. But we're all time travelers as well, because the other way in which we move is that we're all moving through time. And if we build research around the notion of having continued access to research whenever you are, then we can start looking at a sort of a temporal dimension to the sorts of results that we get. So, for example, you can ask people to catalogue the highs and lows of their mood over time. So we did a project looking at women's moments of self-confidence and moments of doubt. Now, if you ask people to take a snapshot of that, you probably don't learn anything. But if you ask them to catalogue them as they happen, as well as the sort of standout moments, you're going to get a lot more of the sort of micro moments of worry or sort of excitement that happen over the course of someone's life. You can start to describe a changing relationship with a product, with a new product. So, if you take any sort of new product development, if you're sort of issuing a new product for people to test, the reality is that perhaps there's a novelty factor in people opening that box and excited about it when they first see it, but actually over time as they use it, maybe their frustrations come through that weren't there initially. Equally, it could go the other way, and there's some initial frustrations with an onboarding process that actually lead to something that people are engaged with and want to use over time. The other thing is as well, if people have continued access to a research project over a period of time, it's this point about not having to rely on people's memory in the same way. You can actually ask them to summarize a conversation that they have literally just had. So if I'm talking about Coca-Cola to a friend, and we're having a good conversation about it, I'm probably not going to remember it, even an hour later, 2 hours later, the next week. But if I can pick up my phone and just go, yeah, I was speaking to Phil about like the new bottle shape of Coca-Cola, it's great or whatever, you've managed to capture it in a way that you wouldn't have been able to otherwise. So looking at that, how does that work in practice? Well, an example of using location is this project. And we were looking at how to optimize purchases of duty-free. So the project was all about duty-free purchase journey. But we didn't tell participants that that's what the project was about. Instead, we framed the project as wanting to understand the entire holiday journey or business travel journey end to end, and ask people to check in every step along the way, from packing the suitcase to arriving at the departure lounge, going through customs, etc., etc. Smartphone technology allows you to go into places that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do. You can't send big cameras and teams into the airports. But the other thing here as well is that because we allowed the duty-free moments to emerge naturally, we didn't prime them that this is what we were interested in, we saw naturally where in that journey it actually came up. Some of the occasions around duty-free were, as you might imagine, when you arrive there. Some of the occasions around duty-free were buying on a plane. And because we hadn't set up the project in a particular way, we could actually see how these sorts of things and understand the psychology of those people much better. But we don't have to only rely on kind of natural, passively take these sorts of things back. If you design research around context, you can also set up research projects where you're purposefully changing people's context. So setting people missions to go and complete, to put themselves into different perspectives or change their behavior in some way or another, and look at what that actually does to the way they think and behave. So for example, you might expose people to, ask people to visit a competitor. If they've been using some product for their whole life, just try something new. You could equally ask them to try a new product that maybe they've never asked before. And, and as an example of that, there we are. We can set a mission. Here's an example of a project where we set people a mission. We were wanting to understand how different people's experience of buying tickets for rail travel in the UK varied. Whether there was, what sort of differences there were in that process. And what we did was we set everybody a mission to buy a very specific ticket, so that they were all going to get that one adult from York to London return going at about 9 AM and back on 2 PM on Thursday, March the 13th. Everybody's been set exactly the same mission to complete, but we let them go through that mission and tackle that particular challenge however they would naturally. And what was fascinating about that is that this was a smaller scale, more ethnographic project. You had 27 participants. They're set exactly the same mission, the same task to do. There were 8 different routes that we could clearly see to get those tickets, and ended up with almost as many different ticket prices as there are participants taking part in the study. What you conclude from that is that the UK rail network is a complete mess. But you can see how we've actually managed to gain some insight without necessarily asking a direct question. In a different example around changing behavior, we wanted to understand the sort of promotions and messaging that you could put to people who were habitual coffee shop drinkers out of home. So these are the sorts of people who would every morning go to the same store, buy a cup of coffee from Starbucks as part of their normal routine. So what we did there was we had a week of collecting their natural behavior, understanding, asking them to take a photograph of what they'd bought, rate it on a set of different scales and measures, but collect it naturally so we understood what their normal behavior was. And after the first week, closed off all of those questions and those tasks, and instead set them a mission to go to a completely different store. So have a week of it going to a competitor and experiencing what life was like on doing something very different. At the end of that second week, we asked them then to sort of, via Vox Pops, sort of tell us about their experience. Tell us what they kind of learned about their relationship with those 2 different brands, the kind of competitor and their preferred supplier. We also, throughout the whole project, asked them to capture moments of advertising that they particularly liked. And of course, because their context had changed, we had a good mix of the sorts of promotions and advertising and messaging that they saw from their existing or their preferred supplier, and also the things that they were now being exposed to going to somewhere else. So you've got this sort of really rich information then about how, what sort of promotions, what sort of messaging might potentially encourage people to change behavior, if indeed it can. Okay, I've talked about how mobile as an approach can be used in its own right and the sorts of things you can do about it. But I think it's really important to acknowledge that it actually complements traditional techniques really well. I don't see mobile as being a replacement. It's not something that's just going to kill off everything else that we've ever done before. Instead, I think it has its own unique sort of properties and its own specific perspective that can actually work best when it's kind of complementing the more traditional reflective approaches. So, responses made in the moment are kind of one perspective, and they tend to be more kind of raw, emotive. When we're kind of like, if I'm telling you about my experience of my commute and the train's just broken down, I'm probably going to be pretty annoyed. But does that translate into a sort of a general attitude of hating my commute and hating my rail provider? Both of those viewpoints are still valid. And the two things can actually really complement one another more directly if you start to use in-the-moment projects as a pre-task or a post-task around, say, focus groups. You can, if it's used as a pre-task, you can bring in some of the material that you've collected as a pre-task and use that to inform some of the conversations that you have as part of the more traditional qual. So as an example of that, there was a project that we conducted where we set up a pre-task ahead of some focus groups, and it was all about understanding people's attitudes towards grocers and supermarkets. In the focus group, people were asked, what do you think of such and such a brand? What do you think of such and such a brand? What do you think of Aldi, which is a discounter in the UK? And to a man, everyone was like, no, I never shop there. I don't go to that shop. But because the moderator had completed a sort of a 2-week pre-task, asking them to record every visit that they made to any kind of supermarket, they were able to sort of say, well, actually, I know that some of you have been to Aldi literally a few days ago. And what is it about Aldi, and what is it about this that means that you're saying that you're not a supermarket shopper at that company? And what was fascinating about that is it opened up an entirely new line of inquiry where it was about they didn't recognize Aldi as a sort of a main grocery shop location. It was all about top up and getting small things and the sort of nipping in and out and getting bits and bobs. But that conversation could never have happened if the pre-task had not been conducted in the first place. And sort of as a final case study, really, just to kind of show you how you can put all of those different elements together, we were asked by an organization called Drinkware in the UK that is all about sort of promoting responsible drinking. And they were developing an app that was about kind of tracking people's alcohol use over the last week. So thank God that we didn't have that the last couple of days. but sort of kind of using it every time that anybody had any alcohol, any sort of drank any alcohol. And what they wanted to understand was the sort of UX issues, the kind of bugs and issues that people might experience, so that they could try and correct some of those things ahead of a full launch of the app. What was really interesting about this project is that we had 60 participants, and they were recruited for a 3-week-long project, but the tasks for those weeks changed every week. So in the first week, we were wanting to understand people's natural use of the app. So they were set no missions. They were just asked that every time they used the app, the application, they tell us what they did on it. They took a screenshot of it. They rated their attitude towards it on that occasion, and they rated their mood. So we had a week of understanding how people would naturally use this platform if left to their own devices. What were going to be the key features that people were going to understand, get behind. In the second week, we closed those off because if you leave people entirely to their own devices, there's probably going to be some features that people would never touch, that they're just never going to encounter naturally. So we had a week of setting a different mission every day to go and explore a very specific part of the application, so we could ensure that everything about it was rated and covered in some respect or another. In the final week, the most kind of engaged and articulate participants were invited to take part in sort of follow-up online forum where the developers were able to sort of, having looked at the sort of behaviors and attitudes of participants over the last 2 weeks, they'd come up with some hypotheses, and we could test that and, and use that, the feedback and build on some of those things to actually get behind what were these issues that people had experienced, how could it be changed, how could it be improved as a consequence. So it's a sort of iterative process where, after sort of 3 weeks, we're actually getting more information about it, sort of building on what we've had before. And the sort of mobile approach, this way of sort of thinking about mobile, naturally lends itself to a sort of very combined qual and quant approach. Because here we had 60 or so participants. Over the entire project, between them, they had uploaded something like 2,000 moments. So in this particular instance, we've got this app use diary that I mentioned, recording every single time they use the application naturally. And we're able to look at, from a kind of quantitative lens, what sort of features were they using, but also understanding, looking at their screenshots, looking at the kind of vox pops that were uploaded, looking at the video, looking at the open ends, also view it in a more qualitative way, understand a bit more depth what people are saying about the platform, saying about the application. So, having said all of that, mobile is not good for everything. It's never going to replace the conjoint study. It's never going to replace the brand tracker that the client has to run because he's got to do his KPIs and collect it in a particular way, and that has to be 30 minutes for whatever reason. And actually, when we first started up, we spent a lot of time where we would get briefs from clients saying, we want to put this on mobile, we want to put this on mobile, and we would go, just don't. That's just not what mobile is all about. Mobile is great for understanding a moment in context. So it's perfect for anything which is kind of journey projects, whether that's a literal journey project like the duty-free example I gave, or a metaphorical journey project, so purchase journeys, understanding the sorts of steps that people take along a path. It's great for life logging, by which I mean sort of gaining an insight into a consumer's life, maybe asking them to take photos of their home, take video of their families, so that you can kind of gain a window into the life of your consumers or a particular segment. Event evaluation, so anything where you want to kind of actually understand the execution of a particular piece of sort of branding or anything like that. It's great for that, because otherwise, how could you know? You might have the best idea in the world, but how do you know what it was actually like for people who are attending? And any kind of product or service evaluation, as I've said before, so exploring people's experiences and how those might change over a period of time. So, and as a sort of a final sort of thought really, what does all of this mean for you guys? I've said this quite a few times, it's moving away from thinking about the 20 to 30 minute online survey and sort of capturing people in one particular sitting, that snapshot. Instead, it's maybe 2 or 4 weeks of micro interactions with research over a period of time. Now, that has big implications because you need to, we all collectively as an industry need to ensure that we maintain engagement with these projects. It's going to be about engaging for a longer period of time as opposed to sort of short, snappy things. And I think we have to acknowledge that that's likely to mean we're going to be paying larger incentives than online quant, that we've done in the past. Your research buyers are probably going to be looking for a certain type of participant, so people who are maybe more articulate, maybe more creative, engaged, because they're going to want to ensure that these people are prepared to engage with this over a longer time. We also need to make sure we're being transparent about what's going to be involved in these projects going in. It's not fair to ask participants to do all of these things, and as Dave from VoxPopMe was saying before, suddenly throwing in a video question that you've known prior knowledge that might happen is going to switch off a lot of people. So it raises a question, I think, about whether, from your side, this means that we ought to kind of be separating off a pool of people who are going to want to engage in these sorts of things and protecting them perhaps from the sort of constant surveys and things like that that people are generally exposed to as part of doing research projects. You know, fundamentally, these projects are kind of mobile communities. So it's about sort of maintaining a longer period of time of interaction rather than, as I say, individual snapshots. Okay. Any questions? You're all stunned. Yep. Yep.
Thank you. How do you go about introducing these concepts to your clients about trying something
Yep.
something that they've never done before?
So these are all genuine projects, first of all. These aren't sort of hypotheticals, you know, sort of this is how you could approach something. These are genuine projects that we did. And you know, as Andy mentioned at the beginning, we've been going now for coming up to 5 years. So we have been doing these sorts of projects, many others like it. So this isn't, I've tried to sort of frame this quite carefully and not tell you that this is the future, because this is what is happening right now. But your second question, I think, is very, very important, because the biggest challenge for us, and I'm sure we've touched on it quite a lot over this conference already, is the need to educate, you know, and we, even though we are, I guess, first and foremost a tech provider, we cannot just take a role of like, here's the platform, you can get on with it. We have to actually advise people. A big part of our role is about consulting with people, advising them, getting as far into the process, as early into the process as we can, so that people are happy to come to us and say, I've got this brief, could be a bit mobile-y, you know, can you give me some advice? And advise them on how they might approach it, the sorts of things to consider when they're writing questionnaires as a consequence, including how you set up something that's not going to leave you in a bit of a state when it comes to analyze it as well. So education and pushing the kind of market forward is absolutely key and fundamental, yeah. Any other questions? Okay. Thank you.